impulse is. What is underneath it? What are the areas of trapped energy? What are the areas of self-betrayal that are going on in very deep levels of the psyche? And then, of course, the soul, and working through its any levels of distortion from the monadic level, which is the first level of differentiating from source. These distortions come forth, do they not, from the soul, and then extend out throughout every lifetime on the planet. And then self begins to believe that there is truly something wrong with self, or that self deserves to be somehow punished. Because most levels of self-betrayal have quite an element of punishment in them, do they not? Because truly, as was discussed earlier, when self looks at the way that self treats self, in terms of the self-betrayal, would self treat others that way?
Not intentionally.
No.
Not intentionally, yes. And why wouldn't self treat others that way if self treats self that way?
Habit.
Societal.
Habit, yes. Societal.
Societal acceptance of that kind of behavior.
Yes, indeed. In other words, if self is harsh with self, self tries not to be harsh with others. Yes? If self is punishing of self, self tries not to be punishing of others. Yes? Is this the way humankind interpreted Master Jesus' teaching, turn the other cheek? Oh goodness. Perhaps we could report on behalf of Master Jesus that that particular teaching has been completely misinterpreted. It's not very clear. Oh goodness. All right, we know we have many questions, and the channel wants to make sure that we cover them. So why don't we go into them?
I betray myself by coming up with good reasons to stay depressed. I may be afraid to come forth as an ambassador of the soul, or maybe I'm afraid of being in a state of ecstasy. Could it be a necessary process of working through karma and purification?
That is a good question, is it not? When self moves into depression, what is the divine function of depression? To bring self deep into self, so that self can access the buried parts of self that have been locked away deep in the psyche. The depression is a vortex. Humankind sees it as a negative vortex. From where we sit, it is a transformational vortex. It might be pulling self deeper and deeper into self. What gets interesting is if self becomes frozen in the depression. Is that part clear?
Yeah.
And what is the depression at that juncture? That depression then becomes a place where self is completely convinced, so to speak, of the voices of the depression, so to speak, of the belief systems that have created the depression. And the depression is so compelling, is it not, that it entrains self. It hypnotizes self, doesn't it? At that juncture, there is a very deep decision, and it is usually not conscious, that self makes to allow self to be entrained by the seduction of that moment. That does not mean that the depression itself is not an important and valuable process that self goes through in the descent experience, in order to be drawn inward to such a level that self is able to make contact with the buried pain in the psyche and in the soul body, in the causal body. Is that very clear?
Yeah.
It is more an issue of what happens when self is down in that underworld territory. So how does self allow self to experience this penetrating vortex that can be quite painful? How does self allow self to move through this and out the other side without becoming transfixed, entrained, hypnotized, frozen, captured by it? Is that very clear for everyone? That is the question, is it not? Because at that level, the self-betrayal sets up, does it not? And what does the self-betrayal say? It says, stay here. Stay in this dark place, frozen. And it is not as if anyone can avoid the dark places within. Is that part clear for everyone?
Yes.
Because that is part of the journey of transformation, of bringing light into the dark, so to speak. It is a metaphysical gift to do so. And therefore, the idea is to allow self to see what happens in that juncture when self has given everything over to the depression to the point that self freezes. Because at that moment, self is right up against the part of self that is trying to hold on to some measure of self-love. In other words, as was discussed earlier by the channel, the origination point of all self-betrayal is based on an effort to protect self, to preserve self. And therefore, it is based on some measure of self-love, except that it is established in a pattern of distortion. Is that part clear? And so it becomes rock hard, and the psyche does it not, because it is coming from a place of self-preservation, self-care, except that it becomes twisted. When self goes into that depression, self finds a place in the depression that is dark, yes, and lifeless, and still, is it not? And in that place is a safe cave, so to speak, for self to take refuge from the torments, the unresolved traumas and torments of childhood and previous lifetimes as well. And it feels as if self can stay in that place and find some measure of comfort, even though the place itself is extremely painful. Is that part clear for everyone?
Yes.
And so therefore, it is most important, is it not, in that moment that self come up to that place of at this juncture, self-betrayal. What is the self-betrayal? That the vortex in the depression wants to take self all the way down to the roots of the issue, as it is alchemizing at the roots, and then rearrange itself naturally, metaphysically, organically, reorganize itself, and then release itself into a new level of consciousness, a rebirth of essence, a transformation of self. Is that part clear? Right in that moment, that stoppage point, self has an opportunity that presents as self-betrayal. Self has an opportunity to meet that self, that loving self right there, and to say, what is it that you are giving self right in this moment? What is this act that looks like self-betrayal and yet is an attempt to protect self? What is that gesture based on? And maybe an aspect of the soul will come forth and say, it is better to take refuge in this dark, still, frozen place than it is to move through the hot fire of alchemy, than it is to feel what is unresolved, than it is to come to terms with the issue of power and exposure. Is that part clear for everyone? And so therefore, self has an opportunity not to negate or despise that aspect of self that would free self there, to embrace it, and it is always good to embrace one's betrayer, is it not? Because when self embraces one's betrayer, self is no longer the victim. Yes? Indeed. So why not throw the arms around the betrayer and get to know self's betrayer? Ask questions and questions and questions. Bring a very curious heart to that betrayer, knowing that deep inside, in the center of that betrayer, is a gesture of love. Is that part clear?
Yes.
Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Next question?
I'm struggling with allowing others to see me as I am. How does that apply to the lesson of self-love or self-betrayal?
It is rather interesting to allow others to see self as self is. Does everyone here allow others to see self as self is?
No.
Oh goodness. All right. As we said earlier, it is not particularly popular, is it? Why is that?
Fear,
Yes, fear of what?
rejection.
Yes, indeed. All right, this tracks all the way back to the monadic level. Did Source reject itself when it differentiated out at the monad level? No. Did the monad perceive that it was rejected? Yes. Did the monad extend forth to the oversouls, and then to the soul, and then to all the extension, this template of rejection? Yes. Is that pretty clear? And so, therefore, this issue of fear that there is something wrong with self, deep down inside, that might be exposed to others. Perhaps self fears that self is too emotional, too sensitive, too vulnerable. Perhaps self fears that self is too needy, or too outspoken, too vibrant, too expressive. Perhaps self fears that self is too selfish, or that self wants too much from life. Or perhaps self doesn't want to have to care that much about others. Perhaps self has some revolutionary thoughts about things that others would think are crazy thoughts. Perhaps self is afraid of being seen as too immature, or too heavy, or too this, or too that. Why don't we simply take the two out of it? Yes? Oh goodness. So it is, yes indeed, that becomes a form of self-betrayal. What is the self-betrayal? The self-betrayal is self decides to put self in the shoes of the others, that self has projected rejection. Is that part clear? Onto. And then self joins them by rejecting self. Is that part clear? Ironically, others may not reject self. Is that part clear? And yet self has decided that they will, and puts self in those shoes and decides, all right, don't worry about rejecting me, I'll take care of it for myself. Oh goodness. And then what happens, of course, and the way that self rejects self is by hiding. Hiding. And once again, then the betrayer is the one who hides self. Is that part clear? Who takes self and all of self's beauty, all of self's uniqueness, all of self's precious gifts, and puts them in a box, in a larger box, in a larger box, and takes this box and puts it in a closet within a closet within a closet, and hides it and hides it and hides it for lifetimes. Is that part clear? Self hides it so deeply that self doesn't even know self has it. There are many that say, well, all right, I am ready to show myself, but I don't even know who that self is. And the more that self has hid self, so to speak, the more that self fears that hidden self. Because then it becomes, in the mind and in the imagination, it takes on monstrous proportions. If it is so deeply hidden, there must be something terribly wrong with it. Is that part clear? And of course there is nothing wrong with it. Dare we say again, nothing wrong with it. Is everyone here taking this in? So that everyone here can take that part of self, that self is hidden away, and make a commitment to that self right in this moment to find out who that self is. At least find out who that self is.